I knew the night was off to a strange start the minute I checked in. The ranger station, which normally felt like a second home to me, seemed smaller and lonelier than usual. Even the warm glow from the overhead lights couldn't chase away the gloom pouring in from the windows. I stepped inside, figuring I'd see Pat, Marcus, and Dana gathered around the battered table in the corner, trading jokes while we waited out another quiet shift. Instead, I found them pacing around, each one fiddling with equipment or rechecking logs. It was my turn to do a final walkthrough outside. Usually, I enjoyed strolling around under the moonlight, scoping out the tree line for raccoons or wandering deer. Tonight, the moon was hidden behind roiling clouds, and the path beyond the station was pitch black. The wind whipped across the roof, making the beams groan. I half wondered if the entire structure would shake itself apart. After a few minutes of testing the locks and listening for anything unusual, I stepped back inside, my jacket dripping with cold dew. Pat gave me this look that said, "All good out there?" I nodded, but I didn't really feel certain. Before I could settle at the desk, Dana spoke up. She's usually the practical one, never letting gossip or superstitions rattle her. But her expression was guarded. She asked if we'd ever heard rumors about the Phantom of Hollow Grove. Marcus let out a nervous laugh, but Pat's face turned serious. Dana explained how this old local legend had been passed around since before any of us were hired, a name tied to unexplained vanishings, especially when the moon was at its fullest. She didn't sound like she was spinning a campfire story. Her voice was calm, too calm, like she was remembering something unsettling. The station lights flickered just then. It might have been a hiccup in the power, but it made every single nerve in me go on alert. Even the fireplace, which usually made the room cozy, seemed to cast weird shadows across the walls. Pat ventured to the window and peered out. The glass was flecked with condensation, making it tough to see anything but vague outlines of trees shifting in the wind. Marcus, normally the easygoing one, was already double-checking the radio as if he expected to need backup at any second. I felt this nagging urge to go outside again, to scan the perimeter and be absolutely sure we were alone. Yet, the idea of venturing past the door gave me pause. I remembered all the times I'd teased guests about being nervous in the dark, and suddenly I wondered if I'd been a fool to brush off what the woods might conceal. Something about the night put a knot in my chest. I kept seeing movement in the corners of my eyes, just enough to unsettle me. Every time I turned, there was nothing but old walls and dusty corners. Dana cleared her throat and said we should try to keep it together, that sometimes these shifts set our imaginations on overdrive. She kept talking about how the stories of Hollow Grove weren't just for spooking tourists. There was a grain of truth buried in them, enough to make even skeptics look over their shoulders now and then. I wanted to brush it off, but I couldn't. Not with the wind howling outside like it had a purpose. Not with the odd quiet in the station, even though the four of us were there. And definitely not with the sense that something or someone was beyond our beam of light, standing just out of sight, waiting. We didn't speak for a while after that. We just sat there, each lost in our own thoughts, half expecting a knock on the door or a flicker of movement in the dark. When we finally did say anything, it was barely above a whisper, as if we were afraid of who else might be listening. Dana had a faraway look that practically begged us to lean in. I could see she wasn't sure if she really wanted to rehash whatever was sitting on her mind, but she let out a shaky sigh and began. "A couple years back," she said quietly, "I was finishing up a shift here. The weather had been horrible for days. Relentless rain, all the trails basically sludge. Nobody was bothering to visit, which meant I had to keep an eye out by myself. That night, I was still new enough to think every single bump outside could be a stray animal. Except, the sounds I heard weren't from an animal." She paused, gazing at the table. None of us moved. Even Pat, who usually tries to crack a joke and break tension, just watched her in silence. Dana went on about how she'd spent the whole evening hauling fallen branches off the paths. When the sun set, she ducked inside, thinking she'd wait out the storm and call it a night. The wind was raging so hard the station windows rattled every few seconds. Finally, her stomach growled, so she ordered from the nearest diner. Old Henry, a delivery guy everyone in town knew, pulled up half an hour later. She stepped out onto the porch to grab her food. "I remember how dark it felt," she said, rubbing her hands together like she could still feel the chill. There was this dampness that wouldn't let go. The diner headlights cut across the station's walls, but everything else was swallowed by black sky. She tried to keep it casual, chatting with Henry about the rain, about how he managed to drive in such miserable conditions. But he kept glancing over her shoulder. Finally, he blurted out that somebody was standing among the twisted oaks near the fence. Dana saw nothing at first, just the silhouette of trees shifting in the wind. Then she made out a shape, thin, ragged, like it was half crouched behind a trunk. That's when they both heard it, something like a hushed voice telling them to go. "It didn't feel like a threat," Dana admitted, tapping her fingers on the table. "It was more like someone warning us. But I couldn't begin to guess who or what was trying to help." The fear ramped up quick. She and Henry jumped into his car without saying a word, not caring about anything but getting down that mud-slick road. The tires spun, kicking up gravel and water, and they raced off. A couple miles later, Henry pulled over, and they just sat there, shaking from adrenaline. Neither one could fully believe what they'd seen. Dana spent the next minutes debating how to explain taking off mid-shift, but it turned out she didn't have to. By that time, she said, the station security system had already caught a group dressed in dark, hooded coats, smashing the door in. They roamed inside for about 5 minutes, rummaging around with this eerie calm. They didn't steal a thing. It was more like they were inspecting the place, searching for something. Then, they walked out into the storm like none of it mattered, leaving behind a few soaked footprints and a lot of unanswered questions. "The cops called me in," Dana said, lowering her voice, "and all they could figure was a botched robbery. But who breaks down a door just to poke around? They never left a single fingerprint." We all glanced around, half expecting to see those hooded figures lurking right outside our windows. Dana's story was unnerving enough, but she wasn't done. She mentioned the little wooden bundle she discovered later, lying in the corner near the supply closet. A pile of twigs bound with a strip of ribbon so tightly knotted that she had to use a knife to cut it. No one in the department could explain it, and eventually, someone just tossed it in a box to be forgotten. "That was the same day the break-in happened," she said. "So call me paranoid if you want, but I've spent every day since wondering why those people came in and who they really were. Maybe it has something to do with all the old stories about this place, or maybe we just got unlucky. But either way, I still can't shake the feeling it's not over." She finished talking, and the low hum of our electrical devices was the only noise left. I was imagining Henry's headlights reflecting on a figure half hidden by trunk and branch, waving them away like it was granting mercy. Dana blinked a few times as if waking from a bad dream, and that's when I realized her story had changed the air in the room. We weren't just rangers killing time on another routine shift. We were 4 uneasy souls perched in a remote station with something out there in the darkness, a presence that might help us or harm us, and we had no way of knowing which. We all fell silent after Dana finished her story, like we were waiting for the shadows outside to respond. Pat broke the tension first, clearing his throat and suggesting a perimeter check. It should have been routine, but every step felt heavy. I volunteered to team up with Dana while Pat and Marcus swept the back. Outside, the air was colder than before. The station's floodlight didn't reach far, so most of the yard was barely visible. I noticed how the wind had died down. It made every noise echo like the forest was an empty stage waiting for an actor to appear. Dana and I started circling around the side, flashlights bouncing off twisted branches and soggy undergrowth. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself we were just being thorough. Yet it felt like we were trespassing on something's territory. A few yards from the storage shed, our beams picked up footprints, barefoot, pressed into the mud. They veered in a weird, meandering path toward the tree line. I glanced at Dana, who knelt and prodded one of the prints with her finger. They were fresh enough to still glisten with moisture. Goosebumps prickled along my arms. Nobody sane would walk around barefoot at this hour. Suddenly, a branch snapped in the distance, louder than it should have been. My flashlight swung toward the tree line, finding nothing but dark shapes. Then I spotted a tiny wooden figure perched on a fallen log, a crude stick person tied with a thread the color of dried blood. For a moment, I could have sworn it tilted its head at me. I knew that was impossible, but it felt real. Dana approached slowly, her steps careful. She reached out and lifted the figure up close. It was damp and smelled faintly of rotting leaves, some kind of totem or warning. We heard murmurs then, hushed voices carrying through the quiet of the night. I flicked off my flashlight, signaling Dana to do the same. Through the gloom, we made out movement. Silhouettes shifting among the trees, maybe 4 or 5. They moved in a rhythmic way, as if following a practiced formation. No flashlights, no phones, just bodies and shadows. We crouched, our hearts pounding, thoughts racing about what we'd do if they headed our way. Pat and Marcus stumbled upon us, nearly causing me to jump. Marcus mouthed, "We saw them too," pointing toward another patch of darkness. We decided in silent agreement to back up to the station. As we retreated, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched. But I caught only faint outlines flickering through the trees. Inside, we locked the doors, drew the blinds, and shoved a heavy table against the main entrance. The logs in the fireplace popped, scattering embers in a sudden burst. Usually that sound is comforting, but this time it felt more like a warning shot. No one sat. We hovered near the windows, peeking out through narrow gaps in the blinds. The station smelled of damp clothes and fear, if fear can have a smell. Pat wanted to call for backup, but Dana hesitated. What if they're gone by the time anyone arrives? We'll look paranoid. She had a point. I remembered the story she told us, the unanswered questions left behind after the hooded group trashed the station. If they were the same ones prowling outside, they'd likely vanish as soon as they heard sirens. Time dragged. The wind picked up again, rattling the siding. My eyes burned from staring out the window, half expecting to see faces pressed against the glass. The phone lines were spotty this far out. If the lines went down, we'd be stranded without any communication. Marcus joked about how we should have transferred to a beach post, but the humor fell flat. We all knew we were in over our heads. Hours later, the forest remained silent, like it was holding its breath for something worse. We agreed to wait for first light before making any bold moves. Whatever lurked outside, it felt like it was waiting too. The 4 of us ended up around the fireplace, jumpy at every twig snap or gust of wind. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew the night wasn't done testing us. As the clock inched closer to dawn, we heard the faintest scrape against the back wall, like someone running a blade or a rock along the wood. I stood, flashlight trembling in my hand. But the noise stopped. No footsteps, no break-in. Just a reminder, they were still out there. We realized morning might not bring any safety at all. But for now, it was the only hope we had. We took turns peering through the windows, watching for shapes among the trees, each minute feeling like an hour. There was a shared, unspoken sense that whatever happened tonight was just the prelude. And as we huddled by the sputtering fire, none of us felt particularly eager to see what came next. I made my decision before sunrise. We all did. By the time the gray light started filtering through the station's grim, smeared windows, our nerves were shredded. Every noise from the night before still seemed to echo in the back of my mind. The shifting silhouettes, those footprints in the mud, that faint scrape against the wall. None of us had slept. We were running on pure adrenaline and dread. Pat asked if anyone wanted breakfast, trying to mask the tension with a sliver of normalcy. But no one had much appetite. Marcus simply shook his head, staring at the barrier we'd set against the door. Dana, who had always been our rock, looked like a stranger. Her eyes were dark, hollow circles. She forced a small smile, but didn't say anything. I realized we'd each reached the end of our tether, We peeled back the blinds to watch the first rays of morning cut through the forest, turning the nearest treetops into dull silhouettes. Though the night had receded, it hadn't taken that malevolent feeling with it. I still sensed we were being watched. Maybe from the shadows. Maybe from beyond the battered fence line. That unshakable dread was enough to convince me I couldn't keep doing this. Marcus packed his gear in a frantic, clumsy way, almost as if he thought we needed to evacuate immediately. I couldn't blame him. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with whatever personal items I could find: spare clothes, an old mug, a few dog-eared field guides. None of us spoke more than a few words, but there was a shared understanding. We were done. For good. It was like the forest itself had finally broken our last bit of resolve. Pat tore down the makeshift barricade, tossing the table aside with a grunt. "I'm not sticking around," he mumbled, blinking away the fatigue that clung to all of us. "I'll do the paperwork, whatever it takes, but I'm not coming back here." Dana stayed silent, but her eyes darted around the station one final time, almost as if she was memorizing every crack and splinter. I could only imagine what she was feeling, given her past run-ins with whatever lurked out there. Then she swallowed hard and whispered, "Let's go." We stepped outside, the morning air chilling our lungs. Instead of the usual dawn chorus of birds, there was near complete silence. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see if we'd actually leave. A low haze lingered around the tree roots, and the wind hissed through damp leaves. That creeping unease wouldn't let up. I felt like eyes were drilling holes in the back of my head. At the trucks, we didn't even try to pretend we'd come back. Normally, there'd be talk of the next shift or a reminder to lock up carefully. This time, we just piled in, turned the keys, and drove away. No glances in the rearview mirror. We knew what we were leaving behind. It wasn't just the station. It was the memory of that horrific night. The footprints in the mud, the indecipherable murmurs among the trees, and the strange totems that hinted we were in over our heads. As we hit the main road, I felt a glimmer of relief mixed with guilt. Part of me worried about the next person who'd fill our roles, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The forest had become too loaded with shadows and unanswered questions. We pulled up to the Central Ranger office later that morning. The woman at the front desk looked startled as we handed over our resignations in near unison. Pat's words tumbled out, shaky but resolute. "We're done. No more nights out there. No more of whatever's in those woods." Nobody asked a single follow-up question. Maybe they'd heard rumors. Maybe they saw our pale faces and realized we'd seen enough. All I know is we gathered our belongings from our lockers without a glance back. I heard Dana quietly mutter that if anyone tried to make her go back, she'd drive 3 states away before she set foot in another forest. Marcus just nodded and patted her shoulder. We left that day, each in our own car, driving away from the ranger service and the job we'd once loved. Even though I was relieved, there was a tiny voice in my head warning me, those woods wouldn't forget us. Sometimes, when I'm alone and thinking too much, I picture the bare footprints and those hooded shapes slipping back beneath the branches. There's a sense of finality to it, but also a lingering question mark. Did we escape or just postpone the inevitable? Either way, I've got no intention of going back to find out. And if anyone were to ask, I'd tell them the same thing. Some places aren't meant to be understood or conquered. Some forests can keep their secrets. And I'll keep my distance forever. Between February of 1983 and November of 1985, I was employed by the United States Forest Service. Back then, the Forest Service ran a kind of earn-as-you-learn program, where you could spend a couple of years as a paid intern, learn the ropes, and then graduate as a fully fledged forest ranger, if you proved yourself capable. I signed up, was selected for induction, and then was sent up to the Woot National Forest as a trainee ranger. I spent the next 6 months realizing I was just about born for that kind of work. I'm not saying it couldn't be hard. It was exhausting at times, but the sense of duty, the feeling that you were doing something good and honorable, was more valuable to me than any paycheck. Those first 6 months were some of the happiest of my life, and at the time, I could see myself walking trails and working on restoration projects for the rest of my career. But then, toward the end of '83, I was offered a very different kind of assignment. Having proven myself capable of working unsupervised and having already confessed to enjoying all the solitude the job had to offer, my district ranger, basically the area chief, asked if I wanted to spend the summer of '84 working as a seasonal fire lookout over on Waldo Mountain. Waldo Mountain is around 50 miles east of Eugene, Oregon, and it overlooks Waldo Lake as well as the Waldo Wilderness area to its north. The lookout is no longer functioning as such today and operates as a kind of public shelter on a first-come, first-served basis. But back then, it was a fully stocked, live-in fire lookout that was occupied by either a forest ranger or a trained volunteer all summer long. The usual arrangement was that 3 different rangers would each do a month-long stretch up at the lookout. But when it came to delegating fire lookout duties for the following summer, staffing problems meant that there were only me and 1 other member of the park staff available for the job. If I did a 6-week-long stretch up in the lookout from early June until mid-July, my district ranger would make sure it reflected very favorably on me when it came to offering me a full-time position. And so, about 6 months after the offer, I was headed out to Waldo Mountain with my first 2 weeks' worth of supplies. Now, a lot of you might be picturing the Waldo Mountain lookout as being your typical sort of tower and cabin structure. And that's exactly what I was picturing too, before I actually saw the thing. But when I got there, I found it was basically just a small cabin built atop a rocky outcrop. As you can imagine, being so high up on top of a mountain, the views from inside the lookout were nothing short of spectacular. But boy, was it cramped in there. It was maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a cooking and sleeping area crammed into one corner, a small map table in the center, and some cabinets and the ham radio tucked into another. That was to be my home for the next 6 weeks, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't find the prospect just a little daunting once I was actually faced with it. I thought being alone up there would be easy. The only thing I didn't really consider was the sense of boredom that would set in once my regular duties were out of the way. Being a fire lookout isn't just sitting around waiting for a fire. Since weather conditions hugely influence wildfire behavior, lookouts monitor things like temperature, humidity, and wind speed in order to assess danger levels and potentially even predict a fire's source and behavior based on those observations. This can actually take up a surprising amount of time. Outside of that, lookouts are entirely responsible for maintaining and repairing their shelter and equipment, which, again, can swallow up a surprising amount of time once you realize the summer rains can make your lookout leak like a sieve. But once all those observation and maintenance tasks were over and done with, life up on Waldo Mountain was actually kind of boring. I started out by hiking up and down the ridge to get a really good look at the area. Sometimes I'd head down to one of the lakes nearby to take a bath. I also planned to make the 2 books I brought with me last the whole 6 weeks. But I finished The Sicilian by Mario Puzo in about a week and discovered I could only read The Hunt for Red October for about an hour at a time before all the technical stuff made my head hurt. So then, one day, with nothing else to do but twiddle my thumbs, I decided to familiarize myself with the ham radio. I'd been left instructions on how to use it, as well as what frequencies to dial into if I ever needed to get in touch with anyone. But I figured that instead of trying to learn on the fly while panicking after spotting a forest fire, I should probably mess around with it a little, if only to test if it was properly functioning. I'd been told that I needed to do weekly radio tests anyway, but all that involved was squeezing the little receiver, saying, radio check, over, and then waiting for a response. But then, I wanted to see if the rumors were true, that on a good day, I'd be able to use that little old ham radio to talk to folks as far away as Hawaii. So, like I said, one day I just sat down at the little desk it was mounted on and decided to start playing around with it. You have to remember, this was way before cell phones were as common as they are today. Back in the early 80s, things like ham radios were a much more popular form of long-range communication, especially among a small band of dedicated hobbyists. That being the case, I figured there was a pretty good chance of me finding a voice among the static. I didn't even really plan on talking at first. I was simply content to find an active frequency and listen in on whatever was being said. But then, since I didn't hear anything, I decided to start talking. I remember cycling through the frequencies, listening first, and then repeating something along the lines of, "This is Waldo Mountain Fire Lookout calling. Do you read me? Over." I'd talk, wait about 10 to 15 seconds for a response, then when I didn't get one, move on to the next. I did this maybe 20 or 30 times, just out of pure boredom really, when on one particular frequency around the 14 megahertz high frequency mark, I suddenly heard a man's voice come back at me through the buzz of white noise. "Waldo Mountain, this is Pelican Butte Fire Lookout," I heard the voice say. "Receiving you loud and clear. How copy? Over." I didn't really know how to talk over radio. I was just told to say over when I was done speaking, and over and out when I was finished talking altogether. So in reply, I just tried to wing it as best I could. "Copy loud and clear, Pelican Butte. Good to hear you." Then I asked exactly where they were located. The guy said he was down near Klamath, almost 80 miles south, and not too far from Mount McLaughlin and the California state line. I guess that's not all that far for a ham radio on a good day, but I was still impressed at how clear it sounded, despite the guy being almost 100 miles away. I was also rather pleased to have someone to talk to. I know I talked about how content I was with my own company, but after going 2 weeks with only one solitary face-to-face encounter with another human being, I was surprised at how much I appreciated hearing another person's voice. The guy said his name was Jim and that he was a forest ranger with the team down in... It was his 5th season in a row acting as a live-in fire lookout. He sounded very experienced and gave me lots of advice, the most appreciated being his tips on how to keep cabin fever at bay. For those unfamiliar with the term, cabin fever is when people start to feel restless or irritable because they've been indoors or in the same place for too long. Some folks say it can drive you crazy, and although there's no real danger of that up in a fire lookout, that sense of being trapped with your own thoughts can wear on even the strongest of people. I jokingly asked Jim if he ever knew any lookouts who went crazy, either from the isolation or just being stuck in one place for all that time. He reassured me by saying no, he'd never known anyone to lose their mind or anything. He'd known plenty who quit, especially the civilian volunteers that were drafted whenever staffing levels weren't ideal, but he'd never known anyone to go crazy. Then Jim did mention how he thought I was very brave for taking the Waldo Mountain Lookout this season, especially in light of what happened to the last volunteer. Obviously, those are just about the most ominous words a person in my position could ever wish to hear, so right away I asked Jim what he was talking about. He gave me this almost theatrical kind of, "Oh, you didn't know?" and then started saying how he didn't think he should be the one to tell me. But luckily, it only took a little polite cajoling to get him to spill the story. As a matter of fact, I never actually asked what happened to the previous year's lookout. I just took it for granted that a ranger or volunteer had completed the season without any sort of incident. It didn't even occur to me to ask about previous lookouts or their experiences. I just blindly accepted the position, thinking it'd be a paid camping vacation. There was obviously the slight danger of animal attacks if you strayed too far from the lookout, and I had heard rumors of a tower up in Washington getting struck by lightning. But aside from that, what else was there to go wrong up here? Well, Jim was nice enough to fill me in. The last Waldo Mountain Fire Lookout, who had volunteered the previous year, had vanished during the final few weeks of their assignment. One day, A ranger went up to the lookout with some pallets of canned food and water, only to find the place completely deserted. They looked around a little, thinking the volunteer lookout was off taking a wash or something of that nature, and then decided to wait for them. An hour or so passed, so instead of waiting any further, the ranger headed back to HQ and figured they'd check in via radio to make sure the volunteer was doing okay. 24 hours passed, and no one had heard a single thing from the volunteer lookout. So another ranger headed up Waldo Mountain to check on them, only to find the place still deserted. The ranger team figured the volunteer had simply had enough and called it quits. But if that was the case, why was all their stuff still up in the lookout? All their clothes and their food were still there. Hell, even their boots were just lying inside the door, meaning that wherever they went, they did so in bare feet, or maybe sandals. Jim said he and the team down in Clamo followed the volunteer's disappearance as best they could. Losing a lookout like that felt personal, and Jim said the Clamo team even sent a few rangers up to Wamut to help with the search and rescue effort. But the volunteer was never found, and as far as Jim knew, they were still officially a missing person. I asked him what he thought had happened to the missing volunteer, and he said it was difficult to say. It wasn't out of the question that they'd taken a nasty fall someplace, maybe even down a ravine or into a hidden cave system, which might explain why they were never found. But then again, Jim said that you also couldn't rule out some kind of foul play. Maybe it was a personal thing. The volunteer had an enemy, someone they'd made very angry, who was devious enough to realize that hitting them someplace secluded like that might make for the perfect murder. Or maybe, just maybe, this poor soul got themselves selected almost at random by a killer who saw an opportunity and just took it. I remember listening to all of that and feeling the hairs on my arms and neck stand on end. Jim said he didn't mean to scare me and offered up a final theory involving the volunteer just voluntarily leaving, having gotten sick and tired of the lookout lifestyle to the point that they couldn't even bring themselves to carry their stuff home. You did indeed get the occasional rich kid heading up there to find themselves or something for those 3 months, only to realize they were wasting their entire summer vacation by week 2 or 3. So, if he had to put his money where his mouth was, Jim said he'd have gone with that. Granted, that final theory was probably the most likely outcome, but I'm also not scared to admit that the stuff he'd said first had me pretty shaken up. I kept a .38 with me just in case I ran into an overly friendly mountain lion, and that would obviously work at keeping a person at bay too. But the idea of someone creeping up on the lookout in the middle of the night while I was fast asleep, that was most definitely enough to give me the heebie-jeebies. I thanked Jim for passing on the info. Then, at the next available opportunity, I asked one of the WT Rangers about the missing volunteer from the previous year. They said they had no idea what I was talking about, that the ranger who had served as lookout the previous summer was one of the same ones who couldn't do it this year. I'd actually worked with this ranger on several different occasions, so I knew from personal experience that they hadn't gone missing, or that if they had, they sure had turned up again. I mentioned this to Jim the next time I got in touch with him, and he basically gave it the old, "Oh, that's what they told you, is it?" And I suppose they had folks just jumping at the chance to serve as lookouts this year, huh? Hearing him say that prompted a moment of terrified realization, so much so that I literally felt the color draining from my face as I listened. It was possible that Jim knew the WT Ranger had trouble finding lookouts for that season, so much so that I'd been asked to complete an extended stay. But even if he didn't know and it was just pure guesswork on his part, he was right. Once again, I got in touch with WUTHQ using my ham radio and asked them if the whole missing volunteer thing was true. My district ranger denied the whole thing and told me that I must have been getting some bad info from someplace. He said that he'd never heard of any Jim down there and that he'd be in touch with Clamo's district ranger all the same. He claimed that it wasn't very professional for one of the Rangers to be spreading rumors like that, and that I was to disregard anything I'd been told. Now, I know I should have just listened to my superiors at WUT, but you also need to appreciate the unusual position I was in back then. There just wasn't any Google or smartphones to fact-check things at the drop of a hat. All I had with me was my radio, and I couldn't simply abandon my post to go off investigating all the stuff I'd been told. The only thing I really had to go on was this. Unlike other years when the Rangers were inundated with hundreds of volunteer lookout applications, it had been almost impossible to properly staff the lookout for the '85 season. That's the thing that played on my mind until, in the end, I had no idea who to believe. As crazy as this might sound, I chose not to confront Jim regarding what he told me about the missing volunteer. In my head, I rationalized it by telling myself how Jim might have been mistaken somehow. Maybe he was confusing Waldo Mountain with another Oregon lookout, or maybe even one up in Washington. He might have also gotten mixed up regarding what year this person went missing. Either way, I didn't want to alienate the only other person I could talk to for prolonged periods, someone who knew what it was like living at a fire lookout. Anyway, about a week later, Jim and I were talking one evening when he asked if Waldo Mountain was anywhere near Deschutes County. I had to check my map table, but lo and behold, WT National Forest was right on the border of Deschutes County. Jim went on to tell me that he had an old high school buddy who lived out near a place called Lapine, which, when I checked, was only around 25 miles from Waldo Mountain. Jim's high school buddy had checked in to say hi, but also to tell him a troubling story about a break-in that had occurred in his neighborhood just the previous night. Someone had broken into a family home completely silently, then crept up the stairs. But instead of robbing or hurting anyone, the intruder crept into the husband and wife's bedroom and just watched them sleep. The wife said she woke up, saw some shadowy figure looming over her, and screamed. Her scream woke up her husband, which prompted the intruder to hightail it out of there. No one was hurt, but the whole neighborhood was spooked. After the news hit the airwaves, the whole of Lapine and Deschutes County seemed to be on edge. I didn't need to ask why Jim told me all of that, and as I listened, I felt this icy chill run through me. I knew I was 25 miles away from where the break-in had happened, but I couldn't help but picture the intruder creeping up to my lookout before watching me sleep. I had my .38 with me, which made me feel a lot safer. But all the way out there, miles away from just about anything, no one would come running at the sound of my screams, because there would be no one there to hear them. I think Jim could tell how spooked I was because good old Jim seemed quick to reassure me. He didn't think I was in any real danger, but in light of the incident's proximity to Waldo Mountain, as well as what had supposedly happened there a year before, he figured it was worth giving me the heads up just in case. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the radio dialed into Jim's frequency, and he did the same with me. He checked in once or twice just to make sure that I was all right, and each time I only had good news to share. But on more than one occasion, I heard something from outside the lookout that had me clutching that .38, shining my flashlight through the dirty glass windows, and praying that I wouldn't see anyone approaching through the darkness. Thankfully, I never did. I heard a bunch of things that scared me just about out of my wits, but never anything that I felt might threaten my life. That same fear wasn't quite as strong the next night, and Jim reassured me that there hadn't been any more of those creepy break-ins over in Lapine. But still, it weighed on my mind for quite a few nights after, and I don't think I got more than 3 or 4 hours of solid sleep during each one. Then came the day when I finally got to talk to my district ranger over the ham radio and got the opportunity to ask him some follow-up questions regarding that missing volunteer from the year before. My district ranger, who had been in touch with the folks down in Clamo, said that there had been no record of anyone named Jim staffing any of their lookouts. This wasn't something that I could let go of, though, So I confronted Jim on it, and this is what he told me. He swore on his grandchildren's lives that he really was in an old fire lookout tower down in Klamath County. It just wasn't in service anymore, and neither was he. Jim told me that he'd spent 30 years in the Forest Service, and for his final 5, he had indeed spent every summer up in a fire lookout. Now, he was retired, but since his wife had passed, he found that he missed being out in nature during those long Oregon summers. With his old lookout being permanently freed up, he decided to head out there, fix it up a little, and then spend the summer steeped in nostalgia. Jim figured that he'd come off as some lonely old coot if he told me the truth, so instead, he told me a little white lie, never imagining that he'd eventually be found out. He swore that everything else he told me was the truth, especially all the stuff about the volunteer going missing. And truthfully, I believed him. It made perfect sense to me, as much as I needed it to, anyway. I just didn't want to lose that voice in the static, the one I was counting on more and more to keep me sane. The first few weeks had been a breeze, and although the addition of Jim had been welcome, it had not been entirely necessary. But then, toward my final week, week 6, I realized that I had just about reached the limits of my endurance for isolation, and I had actually started to consider Jim a good friend. With that in mind, you can imagine the fear that I felt one night when Jim got in touch over the radio with a distinct sound of terror in his voice. As I said, we had been keeping our radios tuned to one another's frequencies at night, just in case anything bad happened. It had been a quiet evening, but then at around midnight, my radio suddenly burst to life with the sound of Jim's voice. "Jake, it's Jim," he said in a slow, shaky voice before asking, "Are you there? How copy? Over." Hearing the urgency in his voice, I rushed over to the radio and began asking him what was up. He then told me, in this frantic, fractured style of speech, that he'd heard someone moving around in the darkness outside his lookout tower. Then, after grabbing his flashlight and heading out onto the walkway outside his cabin, he realized that there were several dark figures in the woods surrounding him on 3 sides. Right away, I told Jim to get the hell off the frequency so he could call for help. But Jim then told me that he'd already tried to contact his HQ down in Klamath, but no one seemed to be manning the radio. He needed me to contact my Ranger HQ so that they could call the cops down in Klamath. I told him I'd do that right away, but before I could twist the frequency dial, I heard him shouting, "Wait!" Jim then started to explain, in the same terrified voice, that the cops needed to know which Pelican Butte to drive out to. Apparently, there was already a Pelican Butte campground down in Klamath County, and the cops needed to head to the old lookout tower Jim was manning, which was off Falls Highway near the 4M Flat Quarry. If I didn't pass along this crucial piece of information, Jim would be screwed. I remember frantically scribbling all that information down and asking Jim to repeat the name of the forest road he had mentioned at one point. And then, after waiting for his response, this is what I heard. Jim's voice suddenly broke through the static and said, "Oh God, they're coming up the stairs." I told him to lock and load the rifle he'd mentioned having with him and to shoot anyone who came through the door to his cabin. I then heard Jim screaming, "Oh my God! Oh my God! What the hell are you people?" And the next thing I heard was a loud bang, then another and another. Jim let out a scream, and then, once his own had sort of petered out, something else unleashed an ear-splitting, inhuman roar before the transmission suddenly went quiet. I've faced some pretty terrifying moments in my life, but that right there might just take the cake. I thought I had just heard Jim, a man I'd grown remarkably close to over the previous 5 weeks, being shot to death in a lookout tower almost 100 miles from where I was sitting. I flew into a full-blown panic, trying desperately to dial into the frequency of the WUTHQ. Once I had one of the Rangers on the other end, I began to frantically relay everything I'd heard, including all the details about going to the correct location. Then, once they had promised to contact the Klamath County Sheriff, I switched back to Jim's frequency and began calling out to him across the airwaves. "Jim," I said. "Jim, are you there, buddy?" And the airwaves stayed silent. Nothing but the cold buzz of static. I begged him to say something, say anything. I told him the cops were on their way, that he just needed to hang on and everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew things most probably were not. Jim had mentioned spotting several people circling his tower in the woods below him, which meant the odds were not in his favor. So when he set the radio's handset down, it hit me that the man I'd gotten to know so well over the previous 5 weeks had just been brutally murdered before my very ears. But then, just as my head sank down in my hands, the radio buzzed to life and someone began to speak. "Hello?" someone asked. The voice sounded like it belonged to a younger man. "Is anyone there?" I rushed over to the radio, announced my presence, and then asked where Jim was and if he was okay. In reply, and in a way that I could almost hear him grinning, he told me, "Sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Jim is dead." I heard laughter before the transmission cut out. In response, I started yelling about how they wouldn't get away with what they had just done. I told them the authorities were already on their way, that they were all going to rot in jail. But when I figured whoever was on the other end probably wasn't listening anymore, I ceased my rant and let go of the push-to-talk button, only to hear laughter coming from the other end. It was maniacal, gloating, satisfied. Just as I was leaning forward to change the frequency and rid myself of the taunting howls of a murderous stranger, they spoke once more. "You're so stupid," I heard them laughing. "I can't believe you sent the cops out there." The voice had changed almost completely, but in my confusion, I didn't quite realize what was going on yet. I reached over, picked up the handset, and once again asked where Jim was. "There is no Jim, you moron," I heard in reply. "It was me this whole time, and you ate it up. What kind of sad, lonely piece of human trash are you? You ate up every word." I was speechless, stunned into a dumb silence, and all I could do was listen. "Goddamn," the young man said. "I knew I was good, but I didn't think I was that good." He let out another long, wheezing laugh. Then, once he pulled himself together a little, he asked if I was still there. I didn't know what else to say. I picked up the handset, and the first thing that came to mind was the first thing out of my mouth. "You should be ashamed of yourself," I said. "And you should off yourself," came the reply instantly, with the man screaming those last 2 words so loud they were almost lost in distortion. As I leaned over to the radio set to change the frequency, more of that same warped, maniacal laughter poured out from the small tinny speakers, only to be suddenly silenced with the twist of the dial. To say I felt foolish would be the understatement of the century. That guy dangled a little bait in the water, and not only did I bite, but I swallowed it hook, line, and sinker too. There was no Jim. There was no missing volunteer lookout from the year before. But then again, I bet some of you figured that one out a long way back. I also bet that guy knew so much about being a fire lookout because he'd talked to one a whole bunch, most likely using the same ham radio he used to talk to me. Then, I don't know, maybe what was intended as a one-time prank just snowballed. It wouldn't be too hard to fake all those sounds either. The gunshots and the screams, I mean. But what must have been difficult for anyone in their right mind was having the patience to drag me through a 5-week-long con before delivering that horrifying final performance. That's what, for me at least, makes this all seem like a lot more than just a playful prank. He didn't just string me along for a day or two, call me a sucker, and then disappear from the airwaves to waste some other radio operator's time. He kept things going for more than a month. He put hours into talking to me, into building his character and earning my trust. He put on the gravelly smoker's voice of a man in his 60s, and he did so for hours upon hours upon hours. Then, in the end, the kid, I guess, who ended up screaming at me through the airwaves sounded like his balls had only just dropped. He made me believe in a person who didn't exist, and as much as that speaks to the sheer magnitude of my own idiocy, I think it says a lot about his being a psycho too. I spent the rest of my final week in a kind of semi-depressed daze. I felt like the single stupidest person on the face of the earth, a weak-minded, pathetic excuse for a man who got so lonely that he fell for the dumb prank of a bored, psychopathic teenager. And that's the thing, too. I didn't just fall for it one time. I fell for it again and again and again. Every time I picked up that handset and started talking to Jim, I let that black-hearted little brat take me for a ride all over again. I'd been humiliated, stripped of any and all pride, and when the time came to leave the lookout, I was only too happy to put the whole thing behind me.
I should have known something was off when my supervisor called me in for an urgent adjustment to my usual shift. A bunch of people had recently bailed on the night schedule without much of an explanation, so it landed in my lap. At first, I wasn't exactly thrilled, but a small part of me was curious about what it would be like to watch the park after dark. I guess I figured it would be hours of quiet, broken up by the occasional hoot of an owl or the flicker of a flashlight. So there I was, hiking up the tower's endless steps, with a backpack full of coffee, energy drinks, and whatever courage I thought I had. The night air tasted cool, almost damp, and my boots crunched on the gravel in a way that echoed, like I wasn't the only one listening. By the time I made it to the top, my legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to shrug it off. The tower's narrow wooden platform led me into a cramped room with 3 walls of glass and a 4th wall hosting a door. There was a rickety bed, a tiny kitchen corner with a mini fridge and a microwave, plus a desk where the radio station sat, blinking. I gave the radio a test. Static popped and hissed, but Donnie's voice eventually came through, saying something about how I'd better make friends with my flashlight because the moon was barely out. That bit of chatter steadied my nerves a little. At least I wasn't alone in the world. I stepped onto the balcony to get a proper look at my surroundings. Trees stretched in nearly every direction, their tops swaying faintly in the breeze. Off to my right was the lagoon, which looked more like a giant puddle choked with algae, lily pads, and random debris. The water sat way too still for my comfort. Meanwhile, the usual nighttime orchestra kicked up. Frogs, crickets, leaves rustling. It was almost soothing. I leaned over the balcony rail, scanning the area with binoculars. At first I spotted nothing except a few moonlit clearings and shadows that I assumed were just logs or rocks. But near one of the ridges, I caught a glimpse of something pale, a shape that stood out against the dark. It looked suspiciously like a person. Maybe a kid wearing a blanket with 2 big circles where eyes might be, a ghost costume, in the middle of summer, on federal land, with no one else around. It threw me off so hard, I nearly dropped the binoculars. I blinked, steadying the lenses again. The little ghost figure was still staring straight at the tower. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some leftover prank, but my gut churned in protest. I pulled out my handheld radio and called Donnie. "Hey man, you in earshot? I don't even know how to say this. There's a kid dressed like a ghost on the ridge right below the big dip in the tree line." Donnie sounded as confused as I was. "A ghost? You serious?" "As a heart attack," I muttered. "Could be some lost camper kid, or maybe a runaway. Want to check it out before it becomes our problem?" He sighed but agreed. "Fine, I'll head that way. Keep your eyes on them and let me know if they move." I caught a flicker of Donnie's flashlight weaving through the dark beneath me. He wasn't fast, but at least he was going in the right direction. I stayed on the balcony, sweeping the binoculars around, glancing back at the ridge every few seconds. The figure didn't move at all, like it was a statue with a bedsheet draped over it. Then, just as Donnie's light got close, his flashlight went out. The beam vanished so abruptly that I thought maybe my eyes had tricked me. My radio let out a burst of static, and Donnie's voice cut off mid-sentence. In that exact same instant, the forest dropped every sound it had. Not one chirp. Not one rustle. The hush felt alive, like I'd stepped into some bubble of silence. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I stumbled back into the tower, practically yanking the door off its hinges to close it. I tried calling Donnie again. Nothing but static. My flashlight spotlighted the corners of the tower's room, and everything looked normal, but my nerves were lit up. I decided to go back outside, maybe yell into the darkness a few times. That was when I noticed a shape below, next to the first flight of steps. It looked like a woman, but impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, with a soaked dress clinging to her body. Her hair dangled in wet clumps, and she seemed bent at odd angles, like someone had tried putting a puzzle together the wrong way. She wasn't just dripping, she looked swollen with water, her skin a sickly bluish color that glistened in the moonlight. She lifted her face, eyes cloudy like murky pond water. Her mouth stretched open, far too wide. A sound emerged, a high-pitched gurgling, way too loud to be human. My stomach flipped. Every cell in my body demanded I get the hell away from that door. I jumped back inside, locking the knob as fast as I could, though a flimsy piece of metal didn't feel like it could stop anything. The radio squawked uselessly from the desk, providing zero comfort. I stayed there, pressed against the wall, trying to catch my breath, shining my flashlight at the door, in case the woman decided to break it down. I could still sense her presence outside, but I had no idea if she'd left or if she was crawling her way up to the balcony. Then, the closet door creaked open. I nearly dropped my flashlight. Instinct forced me to raise the knife I'd grabbed earlier, my heart hammering like an engine in my chest. And out stepped a little ghost, the same ragged sheet I'd seen on the ridge. That was enough to make me want to scream, but then the figure lifted it off, revealing Marvin, Donnie's son, sporting a grin so wide you'd think he'd scored the prank of the century. I felt heat flush my face. "Marvin, what the hell?" Before the kid could answer, another voice crackled over the radio. "There he is. How'd he do, Marv? He freak out?" Recognizing Donnie's voice, I stomped across the room and grabbed the radio. "You set me up?" I yelled, so furious my voice went ragged. "Hiding your kid in my tower, dressing him like some cheap little ghost?" Donnie and his other son, Joey, started howling with laughter. Apparently, they'd been planning this for days, sneaking Marvin in here before my shift, making a show of him standing on the ridge, cutting the power to Donnie's flashlight at the perfect moment. I'm sure they expected me to lose it. Mission accomplished. "Relax," Donnie cackled. "It was just some harmless fun, man. Thought we'd welcome you to the graveyard shift in style. How's your blood pressure?" I felt relief and anger crash together like thunderclouds in my gut. But then, what about that thing outside? I choked out. Silence. Then Donnie let out a short laugh, one that sounded less certain. "Wait, slow down. You think I hired an extra for your personal horror movie?" He chuckled. "We only planned the ghost kid. That's it. No ladies in sight." His words hit me like a punch to the ribs. Even if they'd orchestrated a bunch of details to fool me, that shrieking creature I'd seen was way beyond a backyard prank. I couldn't shake the memory of that stretched skin. I had the insane urge to fling open the tower door just to see if she was still out there, but the possibility kept me rooted in place. Marvin must have seen the alarm still etched on my face because his grin faltered. Dad," he said softly into his own walkie. "What if someone else is out here?" The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. After a moment, Donnie tried to keep it light. "Look, maybe you saw a deer, or your eyes played tricks on you. It's late, and you're wound up. We'll swing by once we finish up. Sound good?" I clicked off the radio without answering. My anger was draining, replaced by an old, deep fear that stuck to my thoughts like tar. Part of me wanted to chase Marvin out with a scolding, but a stronger part, maybe the protective side, wouldn't risk letting him leave alone until this thing was explained or gone. I had zero trust in that black stretch of forest. I paced the tower, double-checking windows and fiddling with the lock on the door. It felt so thin, like a stiff wind could knock it down. Meanwhile, the night outside remained too quiet for comfort. Marvin looked just as jumpy as me now, hugging his arms close to his body, like the joke wasn't so funny anymore. Time crawled. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement outside, a branch shifting or a swirl of mist over the lagoon, but I never saw that gaunt figure again. It was almost worse, not knowing if it was still lurking beneath the tower. At one point, a faint screech echoed from somewhere in the woods, and I nearly tripped over my own feet, spinning around to face the door. Marvin squeaked, then tried to laugh it off, but his eyes were wide. By the time the first streaks of dawn arrived, I felt shredded. My chest was tight, my muscles stiff from clenching. Donnie came through on the walkie once more to say something about making the rounds, but I barely registered it. All I could think was that if I had to do another shift here, locked in this fishbowl, I'd lose my mind. Jokes were one thing, but that woman's milky gaze was not something you faked with store-bought makeup. I couldn't explain it, and Donnie wouldn't listen. That left me with one real choice. "All right, Marvin, time to go," I said quietly and escorted him down the tower steps in the fragile early light. The two of us jumped at every rustle or bump. I was armed with that kitchen knife, feeling ridiculous but unable to relax. The lagoon looked almost peaceful in daylight, but I was too on edge to appreciate it. By the end of that endless descent, my mind was made up. The moment I got the chance, I'd inform the higher-ups I wasn't staying on nights. Not another hour. Let them call me paranoid. Whatever I'd seen out there, it wasn't just a trick of the dark. Something in those woods had noticed me, and I had no intention of sticking around for round two. Marvin and I trudged toward the ranger station, the first rays of sun hitting the trees in a washed-out glow. Part of me expected to see that soggy figure trailing behind us, but every time I looked over my shoulder, it was only empty space. Maybe that was even scarier. It meant it could still be anywhere. I'd always believed the night shift was nothing but quiet hours, but nothing from this point forward would ever feel normal again. When I glanced back at the tower, all I saw was a lonely shape against the morning sky and the silent, unmoving lagoon. But I remembered that scream. I remembered the hush that followed it too, and I wondered if maybe it was the woods themselves sending a warning. Some things aren't meant to be watched after dark, at least not by anyone who wants to make it home sane. I never liked the idea of working the night shift. The forest feels different when the sun goes down, darker, heavier, like it's hiding something. But I didn't have a choice tonight. Too many of the other guys quit the night shift recently, and they were short-staffed. So here I am, driving through the winding dirt roads, heading to my post at the fire tower. Normally I work during the day, when the trees look green and peaceful. At night, though, they look like tall, twisted shadows. I packed extra coffee to keep me awake and alert. It wasn't going to be easy. The fire tower is deep in the woods, far from the main road and near this big, foggy lake. Even during the day, that lake gives me the creeps. The mist just hangs over it like something's waiting underneath, ready to crawl out when no one's looking. I try not to think about that as I park the truck and grab my gear. It's just one night, I tell myself. The climb up the fire tower feels longer than usual, maybe because the sky is already so dark. By the time I reach the top, the stars are just beginning to peek through the clouds, and everything is quiet. Too quiet. Usually I can hear crickets or owls by now, but tonight it's just still. I drop my bag inside the small room at the top of the tower and take a deep breath. This is my space for the next 8 hours. A tiny room with windows on all sides overlooking a sea of trees. I've always loved this view during the day. You can see for miles, but at night it's like looking into an endless black ocean with no shore in sight. I do my routine check first, scanning the area with my binoculars. It's my job to keep an eye out for any signs of fire or danger. Usually, I don't see much at night, just the faint outline of trees and maybe the distant shimmer of the lake. But tonight, something feels different. I can't shake this uneasy feeling. Just as I'm about to sit down with my coffee, I catch a glimpse of something on the ridge. At first, I think I'm seeing things, but when I focus the binoculars, I know it's real. There, on the far edge of the ridge, is a figure. A small one, like a kid. They're wearing what looks like a ghost costume. You know, the kind with the white sheet and the dark holes for eyes. But it's June. Who wears a costume in June? A chill runs down my spine. I blink, thinking maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks, but the figure is still there. Standing, perfectly still, staring, Or at least it feels like it's staring right at me. I grab the radio. Dan, you there? I ask, my voice shaking a little. Dan is the only other person out here tonight at a nearby station, he answers, laughing. What's up? You sound spooked. I see something weird on the ridge, like a kid in a costume. Dan chuckles. You're seeing ghosts, man. I'll check it out. I keep my eyes glued to the ridge as Dan's flashlight flickers in the distance, getting closer to where I saw the figure. I wait, my heart pounding. I sit in my chair, gripping the radio tightly, my eyes never leaving the ridge. The flashlight beam from Dan's lantern bounces as he walks closer to the spot where I saw the kid. My heart races, my stomach twists. This doesn't feel right. It's too quiet out here. No wind, no crickets, not even the usual rustling of the trees. Just this thick, unsettling silence hanging over everything. I keep replaying what I saw in my head. It wasn't just the figure that was strange, it was how still it was. Too still. And the way the ghostly sheet hung over the small body gave it a creepy, unnatural look. I watch as Dan's flashlight gets closer and closer and closer to the any second now, he'll reach it. And then we'll figure out what's going on. Maybe it's just some prank, some kid sneaking out for a scare. Yeah, that has to be it. Kids do dumb stuff all the time. Dan, getting close, I ask, my voice breaking the heavy silence. I try to sound calm, but I can't hide the nerves creeping in. Almost there, he answers through the radio. His voice sounds normal, like this is no big deal. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it really is nothing. Then suddenly, Dan's flashlight flickers. It sputters once, twice, and then it dies completely. The light goes out and Dan disappears into the darkness. I lean forward, pressing the radio to my mouth. Dan? Dan, you there? My voice comes out shakier than I wanted it to. No answer. Dan! I shout into the radio, the tension building in my chest. I scan the ridge, but now it's just black. No light, no movement, nothing. My hand tightens around the binoculars as I sweep them over the spot where I last saw him. The eerie stillness is suffocating. The wind should be blowing by now. The trees should be swaying, but everything feels frozen in place. Then, just when I think it can't get any worse, the forest itself seems to react. The quiet becomes louder, if that even makes sense. The absence of sound presses against my ears. It's like the whole forest is holding its breath, waiting. I try the radio again. Dan, come on, man, quit messing around. Still nothing. A sick feeling starts crawling up my spine. Something is wrong. Really wrong. I reach for my flashlight and shine it out over the trees, sweeping it back and forth across the ridge. But as soon as the beam hits the spot where the kid had been standing, I stop. Dead. There's nothing there. The figure, the kid, the ghost. Whatever it was, it's gone. My breath catches in my throat. I should feel relieved that it's not there anymore, but instead, it feels worse. My mind races. Did the kid run off? Was this all some weird prank, or was it something else? I start pacing inside the small room, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. Every second that Dan doesn't respond feels like a weight pressing down on me. What if something happened to him? What if... Suddenly, a new thought hits me, sending a wave of cold fear through my body. What if that figure I saw wasn't a kid at all? What if it was something else entirely? I grab the radio one last time, my voice shaking. Dan, please answer. This isn't funny anymore. But all I hear is the static of dead air. I stand frozen in the tower, staring out into the pitch-black forest. The radio is still in my hand, but I've stopped trying to call Dan. There's only silence on the other end, like the whole world has gone quiet just to mess with me. My heart pounds so hard I can feel it in my throat. I shine my flashlight down toward the forest below, hoping, praying to catch some sign of Dan. Anything. His flashlight flickering back on, his voice calling out to me. But nothing. The beam of light just cuts through the thick darkness, barely making a dent in the inky black. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see movement. At first, I think I'm imagining it. I sweep the flashlight back and forth across the base of the tower, searching for what I saw. That's when I spot it. Something, or someone, is moving through the trees. It's slow at first, a shadow gliding between the trunks. I narrow my eyes and aim the light directly at it. My hands start to tremble. A A figure steps into view, and my stomach drops. It's not Dan. It's not even close to Dan. It's a woman. At least, I think it's a woman. Her body is all wrong, tall and thin, so thin that her skin looks like it's stretched over her bones, and she's soaking wet. Her eyes glow yellow, and her clothes cling to her in a way that makes my skin crawl. Her skin looks decayed, like she's been dead for days. But it's her eyes that make my blood run cold. They're wide, too wide, and pure yellow. No pupils, just this blank, terrifying stare. Her mouth hangs open in an unnatural way, like she's about to scream, but no sound comes out. For a second, I can't move. I'm locked in place, staring down at her, trying to make sense of what I'm seeing. This can't be real. It just can't. But then, she starts moving. Fast. Too fast. She's at the base of the tower now, looking up at me with that awful blank stare. And then, without warning, she starts to climb. I snap out of my daze, my heart hammering in my chest. She's coming up the stairs. Too fast. Way too fast for something that should even be alive. I slam the door to the cabin shut and lock it, my hands shaking so badly I can barely turn the latch. Footsteps echo up the stairs, heavy and fast, like she's sprinting. My brain races, trying to figure out what to do. There's no way out. I'm trapped up here. I grab a knife from the kitchen drawer, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turn white. I back away from the door, my eyes can hear her getting closer, closer. Until her footsteps stop, right outside the door. I hold my breath, praying she'll go away. But then, the door handle rattles. She's trying to get in. Suddenly, I hear a loud thud, like something slamming against the door. Then another. The door shakes in its frame, and I know it won't hold much longer. My heart races, my whole body trembling as I back into the corner of the cabin, clutching the knife like it's my only lifeline. Then I hear it, a faint, wet dripping sound. Behind me. I turn slowly, my flashlight beam shaking as it moves across the room. The supply cabinet. The door is wide open, and standing in front of it, grinning through the same dark-eyed sheet I saw earlier, is the child. I can't breathe. My heart feels like it's going to explode out of my chest as I stare at the child standing by the open supply cabinet. The same small figure I saw on the ridge, still draped in that ghostly white sheet with the dark holes for eyes. Except now, it's standing inside my tower. My hands shake as I grip the knife tighter, trying to make sense of what I'm seeing. This can't be happening. How did they get inside? How did they climb the tower so fast? The woman, she's still outside, isn't she? The child tilts its head like it's amused by my fear, and then it starts to laugh. The sound isn't right. It's high-pitched and hollow, echoing off the walls of the tiny room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I take a step back, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fall over. Before I can think, I lunge forward and grab the sheet, yanking it off in one quick motion. The breath catches in my throat. Standing beneath the sheet is Dan's son, grinning up at me with wide eyes and holding a small walkie-talkie in his hand. What is this? I stammer, trying to make sense of it all. Dan's kid. This was all a joke? The boy's grin only widens. Gotcha, he says, his voice full of laughter. Dad said you'd be scared. For a split second, relief floods through me. My knees feel weak and I almost laugh myself. Of course, it was just a prank, a stupid, elaborate prank set up by Dan and his kid to mess with me. I should have known. But then, something in my gut twists. The woman at the base of the tower. She wasn't part of this. I glance toward the door, my mind racing. Dan, I say into the radio, my voice shaky. You're telling me this whole thing was just a prank? The kid in the sheet? The whole setup? Dan's voice crackles back through the radio, still laughing. Yep, my son and I thought we'd give you a good scare. We even rigged the flashlight to die at just the right time. Pretty good, huh? I feel a surge of anger rise in my chest. Pretty good, you nearly gave me a heart attack. But I hesitate. My mouth goes dry. What about the woman? The line goes silent for a moment. What woman? Dan finally replies, his voice serious now. What are you talking about? I swallow hard. The woman, the one at the bottom of the tower, with yellow eyes, pale, climbing the stairs, that wasn't part of the joke? There's a pause, a long, terrible pause, When Dan speaks again, his voice is low and frightened. That wasn't us. A cold wave of terror washes over me. My pulse pounds in my ears as I turn back to the window, and that's when I see her. She's back, standing at the base of the tower, looking up at me with those wide, vacant eyes, and that same twisted, unnatural grin. Her dark hair clings to her face as blood drips from her clothes, pooling on the steps below. But this time, she doesn't start climbing. She just stands there, staring, waiting. My breath comes in ragged gasps, and I can't tear my eyes away from her. My hand grips the knife so tight it hurts. But I know it won't help. I hear Dan shouting through the radio, but I don't answer. I can't. I'm frozen. And then the woman takes one slow, deliberate step toward the tower. And I know, deep down, I won't survive the night.
My name's Brian Patel, and this happened to me in the National Forest in Oregon. I grew up in Portland and spent most weekends hiking the trails with my dad. After he passed away, I kept the tradition alive, even though the solitude wasn't quite the same. I wasn't the sentimental type, but being out there brought some quiet to my otherwise loud, chaotic life as an electrician. That particular weekend, and I'd planned a 2-day solo trek, something to clear my head and test out some new gear. I wasn't an ultralight fanatic or anything, but I liked keeping things minimal. Just me, the trail, and whatever nature threw at me. My route started at Timberline Lodge and cut through some backcountry trails that didn't see much traffic. It was early morning when I set out, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a map in the other. The first few hours were uneventful. The trails were damp from rain earlier in the week, and the scent of pine mixed with the occasional waft of mushrooms kept things pleasant. Around noon, I passed an older couple hiking with trekking poles. They waved but didn't stop to chat, which was fine by me. Solitude was the point. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first odd thing. I'd stopped at a clearing to refill my water from a nearby creek. The silence was too perfect. No birds, no rustling, nothing. It wasn't unusual for animals to scatter when a human came stomping through, but this was eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. I joked to myself that maybe I'd finally reached that perfect peace people were always yapping about in self-help books. As I climbed higher into the denser part of the forest, the feeling lingered. Every so often, I'd hear a snapping twig or see a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I chalked it up to squirrels or deer. That changed when I reached the ridge. There was a campsite up there, or at least what was left of one. A collapsed tent lay flattened against the dirt, its poles bent at odd angles. Gear was scattered around like someone had emptied a backpack in a panic. What caught my attention was the cooler, one of those sturdy, bear-resistant kinds. Its lid was wrenched open, and deep claw marks gouged the plastic. I didn't recognize the pattern. It didn't look like bear claws. Whatever did it had talons. I poked around cautiously. A jacket with a name tag, Franklin, hung on a low branch, ripped down the middle like someone had tried to peel it off. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot, but enough to know something had gone wrong. My stomach tightened. I didn't consider myself squeamish, but the combination of the silence and the blood made the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I didn't linger. I wasn't about to play hero and investigate further, but I also didn't want to turn back the way I'd come. The campsite had a bad vibe, and if someone was injured, I wasn't eager to meet whatever or whoever had caused it. I decided to push forward toward a secondary trailhead about 5 miles out. It wasn't on my original route, but it would get me out of there quicker. The trail narrowed as I descended into a gully. Thick undergrowth swallowed most of the light, and the temperature seemed to drop. My boots squelched in the damp earth as I pushed past ferns that slapped against my legs. About halfway down, I caught a foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp fur. My first thought was a dead animal, maybe a cougar kill left to rot, but it was strong enough to make my eyes water. Then I heard it, a low, deep rumbling noise that didn't sound natural. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't mechanical either. It reverberated through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose the third option, freeze. I crouched low, scanning the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps. I forced myself to move, creeping forward as quietly as possible. The trail curved ahead, and just as I rounded the bend, I saw it, or at least part of it. A massive, hulking shape loomed through the trees, crouched over something on the ground. Its limbs were grotesquely long, the joints bending in ways that didn't make sense. It had patches of wiry fur mottled with bare, pale skin. What struck me most was its posture, like a predator that had evolved to ambush. I stayed hidden behind a tree, trying not to breathe. Whatever it was feeding, its movements jerky and almost insect-like. The thing was tearing into something unrecognizable, its talons slicing through flesh with surgical precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. The smell was overwhelming. A sudden snap of a branch underfoot betrayed me. The creature's head shot up, swiveling unnaturally as it scanned for the source of the noise. I didn't get a clear view of its face, but I did see its teeth, rows of uneven serrated spikes that looked like they belonged in a shark, not on land. I bolted. Stealth be damned, I sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at my face and arms. The sound of pursuit was immediate, heavy footfalls crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. My pack jostled against my shoulders as I weaved through the narrow trail, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. The trail forked ahead, and I veered left without thinking. Bad move. The path led to a dead end, a sheer drop-off into a ravine. My options were limited. Jump and risk breaking something, or turn and face the thing head-on. Neither seemed appealing. I scrambled up a boulder, hoping to gain some height and buy myself time. The creature burst through the trees moments later, its gangly frame silhouetted against the dim light. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its movements were unnervingly smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It paused, tilting its head as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I fumbled for the small knife in my pocket, knowing it was more symbolic than anything. The creature lunged forward, and I did the only thing I could. I threw my pack at it. The motion startled it, and it recoiled briefly, giving me enough time to leap down the side of the ravine. I tumbled hard, dirt and rocks tearing at my clothes as I slid to the bottom. My ankle twisted painfully, but I managed to scramble to my feet. The creature didn't follow immediately, but I could hear it pacing above, its claws scraping against the rocks as it searched for another way down. I limped through the ravine, following the trickle of water downstream. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. The ravine eventually opened up into a clearing, and I spotted a ranger's cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, though it was tempered by the realization that I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. The cabin was locked, but I found an axe leaning against the woodpile. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crouched low, gripping the axe and scanning the tree line. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. When it came, it was sudden. The creature barreled into the clearing, moving faster than seemed possible for its lanky frame. I swung the axe as it charged, catching it in the shoulder. The impact staggered it, but the thing didn't go down. It lashed out with its talons, grazing my arm and drawing blood. We circled each other, predator and prey, roles blurring. I swung again, aiming for its head this time. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a piercing screech. It collapsed, twitching violently before going still. I didn't stick around to admire my handiwork. With my arm bleeding and my ankle screaming in pain, I limped back toward the trailhead, keeping an eye on the shadows. I flagged down the first car I saw, a bewildered couple who probably thought I'd lost my mind. Years later, I avoid Mount Hood. Not because I'm scared, but because I've learned to stick to places where nature follows the rules, or at least pretends to. I'm going to be honest with you. Being a cop in a small town isn't glamorous. It's not like the movies where every day is a shootout or a high-speed chase. It's mostly handling neighbor disputes over where someone's fence ends or someone's dog barking too much. My name's Lucas Giroux, and I've been wearing the badge for 9 years here in Chesterville, Louisiana. Population about 2,000, give or take. I love this town. It's quiet, peaceful for the most part, and I like that. My days are usually filled with mundane tasks, which suits me just fine. I didn't sign up to be some action hero, but that was before what happened in 2014. That night, everything changed. Chesterville sits on the edge of Lake Vere, a slow-moving body of water surrounded by cypress trees and swampland. People here fish, drink, and go about their lives. It was a pretty uneventful Thursday evening. I was sitting in the patrol car near the lake, enjoying the last of my coffee. That's when the call came through. Domestic disturbance, 14 miles out of town, near the edge of the bayou. Some old shack out there. Probably a drunk couple having a fight. I sighed, thinking about how cold my coffee was going to get by the time I got back. I could have ignored the call. In a town this small, people mostly resolve their issues on their own. But it's my job, and I'm not the kind of guy to leave a job half done. So I punched the gas and headed toward the edge of the swamp, the smell of rotting vegetation creeping into the car through the vents. The air always smells different out there. Heavy, like something's growing in the darkness. The address was off the main road, way off. I had to take a gravel path that was barely wide enough for my cruiser, with branches scraping against the sides like they were trying to keep me from going any further. The place was almost hidden behind thick trees, vines practically choking the building itself. It was an old, decaying wooden structure, more of a cabin than a house. When I stepped out of the car, everything felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just on edge because it was so quiet. And in a town where quiet usually means safety, this felt different, like something was waiting. I knocked on the door, no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a scraping noise from inside, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I called out, "Chesterville PD, anyone home?" Still nothing. Now, I've dealt with drunks, domestic fights, and all sorts of noise complaints, but the sound coming from inside wasn't something I'd heard before. My hand instinctively went to my gun as I tried the doorknob. Locked. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in, when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading around the back. But not human ones. These prints were larger, clawed, like some kind of animal. But whatever made them was walking on 2 legs, and they were fresh. I was starting to think this wasn't just some domestic dispute. I followed the prints, feeling a chill in the pit of my stomach. As I reached the back of the cabin, I saw the door was ajar, hanging on its hinges. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dirty mattress on the floor and a table covered in old newspapers. But what caught my eye was the blood. It was smeared across the floor, thick and dark, leading to a corner where something was slumped. I shone the flashlight on it. It was a man, or what was left of him. His body had been torn apart, like he'd been mauled by something much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these parts. His chest was ripped open, ribs exposed, and his face, well, there wasn't much left to recognize. I barely had time to process the scene when I heard that same dragging noise again, but closer this time, coming from behind me. I turned, heart racing, and shone the light toward the sound. Something was moving in the shadows, something big. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand on 2 legs. It stepped into the light and I froze. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with matted fur and a face that looked almost human, but twisted, distorted, like something halfway between a person and a wolf. Its claws were long, too long for anything natural, and its mouth was smeared with blood, teeth glistening like knives. I didn't hesitate. I drew my gun and fired, emptying the magazine into the thing's chest. But it barely flinched. The bullets hit, sure, but they didn't seem to do much more than piss it off. It let out this low sound, like it was irritated more than hurt, and took a step toward me. I backed up, reloading as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I've never been a great shot, but at this range, it didn't seem to matter. Nothing was going to stop this thing. It lunged. I dove out of the way, crashing into a shelf that sent bottles and cans scattering across the floor. My head was spinning, but I managed to scramble to my feet and run for the door. I don't know how, but I made it back to the car, slamming the door shut just as it slammed into the side of the cruiser, rocking it on its wheels. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud as I gunned it back down the gravel path. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there in the rearview mirror, watching. As I sped away, its shape slowly faded into the darkness of the swamp. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to call it in. But what the hell was I gonna say? That some kind of monster tore a man apart and nearly killed me? I thought about it for a long moment, staring at the radio, before deciding to do something I never thought I'd do. I lied. When I called it in, I said I found the man already dead. Looked like some kind of animal attack. Maybe a bear, maybe a wild dog. Hell, maybe both. I didn't mention the thing I saw. I couldn't. No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one out there that night. I found out later that 2 fishermen had been on the lake, close enough to the cabin to hear the gunshots. They saw something too. Something large, moving through the trees. They didn't get a good look at it, but they said it wasn't a bear, wasn't anything they'd ever seen before, and they swore it walked on 2 legs. The next morning, I went back out there with the sheriff and a couple of deputies. We found the body, or what was left of it, but there was no sign of the creature, just those same strange tracks leading off into the swamp. The sheriff wrote it up as an animal attack, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew something didn't add up. I've thought about that night a lot since then, about how close I came to ending up like that poor bastard in the cabin, and about what's still out there, lurking in the swamp. Some nights, when it's real quiet, I wonder if it's still watching. But I've learned not to go looking for answers. Sometimes, in a place like this, it's better to let the mysteries stay buried. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling. But after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating. But I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. "Okay," I muttered. "You've dealt with worse." I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look," I said, pulling out my GPS. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us, the forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packaged it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting, somewhere in the mist, for me to return.
I pulled the RV off the narrow, dusty road and into the shadow of Dead Man's Gulch. The engine sputtered to a stop, and for a moment I sat there in silence, staring out at the barren valley stretching before me. The Ruby Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and dark against the fading light. This was exactly what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and a place where the world couldn't find me. The RV had become my escape after Laura died. I could roam wherever I wanted, park wherever I pleased, and it felt like a kind of freedom. But now, sitting here in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The place had a weight to it, like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, the dry desert air biting at my skin as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Dead Man's Gulch was as desolate as it sounded. I had read about it in a ghost stories book I found at a thrift store. Some legend about miners who disappeared back in the late 1800s. They supposedly saw shadowy figures in the valley at night before the earth collapsed and swallowed them whole. I didn't believe in ghosts, cryptids, or any of the nonsense locals spouted about this place. I just wanted to be alone, away from the pitying glances and endless condolences. No one understood how grief gnawed at you, hollowing you out until nothing was left. Setting up camp took about 15 minutes. I parked the RV next to the remnants of an old mining camp, a few rusted-out carts, the skeletal remains of a cabin, and a collapsed mine shaft disappearing into the hillside. It was perfect. No people, no distractions. Just me, the desert, and the stars. By the time I finished dinner, canned chili, nothing fancy, the sun had dipped below the horizon. I sat at the small table inside the RV, staring at the book in front of me, filled with old tales of ghost sightings and strange disappearances, most of them from around here. The locals called it the Phantom of the Mines, a shadowy creature that haunted the valleys, stalking anyone who got too close to the abandoned shafts. I flipped through the pages, skimming over accounts of miners swearing they'd seen something dark moving in the fog just before disaster struck. I shook my head and closed the book. Ghosts, shadows, it was all nonsense. Laura would have laughed at the idea. She'd never been scared of anything. Not the woods, not the wild. She was fearless. But I wasn't Laura. As I cleaned up, the RV's lights flickered. I paused, glancing at the ceiling. The lights steadied again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just a glitch, I told myself. The RV was old. Things broke. But the air suddenly felt colder. When I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement. something shifting in the darkness just beyond the headlights. I stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The night was still. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses down on you. I scanned the area, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing moved. Just rocks, dirt, and the skeletal remains of the old mining camp. Then I heard it. Faint. Like the sound of gravel shifting underfoot. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Jake," I muttered. "It's just the wind." I turned back toward the RV, ready to call it a night, until I saw them. Handprints, long streaks of dust trailing down the windows as if someone or something had dragged their fingers across the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone. I knew that. No one had passed me on the road for hours. No one was out here. At least no one should have been. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The RV felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the wind outside picked up, howling through the narrow canyon. I sat at the table staring at the window, waiting, but nothing happened. The next morning the RV was completely dead. No power, no lights, no water pump, nothing. I checked the battery. It was completely drained. It didn't make sense. I had it checked before I left. It was supposed to last for weeks. Frustrated, I spent most of the day trying to figure out what was wrong. But everything seemed fine. The battery had just died. By late afternoon, I gave up. I was stuck here for the night. I cursed under my breath. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just bad luck. I decided to go for a walk, maybe clear my head. The old mine shaft loomed in the distance, and I made my way toward it. The ground was hard and cracked, littered with strange deep marks crisscrossing the dirt. They looked like they'd been dragged by something large. Too large. At the mine's entrance, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of dust and rot. The opening had collapsed years ago, the rocks jagged and sharp. But there, in the dirt, were more of those strange marks, long, deep gouges, like something had been clawing its way out. I backed away, chest tightening. It was just a mine, just old rocks and dirt. But as I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow moving at the edge of the rocks. I whipped around. Nothing. I ran back to the RV, heart pounding. That night, the first knock came just after midnight. A loud, deliberate bang on the side of the RV. I shot up, grabbing the shotgun by my bed. My hands shook as I loaded it. Another bang, closer this time. "Who's there?" I shouted, voice cracking. No answer, just the sound of gravel shifting. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door. The cold hit me hard. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. No one. But then I saw it. A dark, shifting figure at the edge of the rocks. Its form flickered like smoke in the wind. It didn't have a face, but I felt its eyes on me. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed, but the thing didn't move. It just faded. I stumbled back inside, locking the door. The lights flickered and then went dark. I sat in total blackness, shotgun in my lap, waiting. But it didn't come back. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up and climbed into the driver's seat. Miraculously, the RV started like nothing had been wrong. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, speeding away from Dead Man's Gulch. The weight in the air lifted. The fog was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had narrowly escaped something dark, something still waiting in those mines. And as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, just in case. My name is Stephen Miller. I'm 51 years old, a retired high school teacher, and a widower. What I'm about to tell you happened just last month during a solo camping trip off Old King Road in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I was looking for peace and quiet, maybe even a little closure. Instead, I found something I still can't explain, something that might still be out there waiting. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The drive down Old King Road was scenic but desolate, with tall oaks draped in Spanish moss and palmettos crowding the edges of the narrow dirt road. My RV, a beaten-up 1994 Winnebago, rattled over every bump, but I was used to it. This wasn't my first trip, but something about the stillness unsettled me. I stopped at a convenience store a few miles before the campsite to grab some firewood and snacks. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, looked up from a magazine as I approached. "Camping out on King Road?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah," I said. "I heard it's quiet out there. Good stargazing. She hesitated. It's quiet, all right. Just don't wander too far from your RV, and if you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it. I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me as I drove the final stretch to the campsite. The sun was low, and I parked near a pond. The water was dark and still, the air smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. I liked the solitude, at least that's what I told myself. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I had a small fire going, and the RV's generator was humming softly. I was sitting by the fire nursing a cup of instant coffee when the generator sputtered and died. The sudden silence was jarring. Damn thing, I muttered, grabbing a flashlight to check it out. Everything looked fine. No loose wires, no obvious problems. When I flipped the switch, it roared back to life as if nothing had happened. I returned to my chair, but the unease lingered. The forest around me felt too quiet, like the wildlife had been holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Probably a raccoon, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The pond looked serene in the daylight, its surface reflecting the grey sky. As I circled it, I noticed something strange, footprints in the mud. They were large, clawed, and definitely not human. A chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw him, a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, standing at the edge of the trees. He was thin, with dirty clothes and wild, unkempt hair. His eyes darted nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you lost?" The boy flinched, but he didn't run. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "Do you live out here?" He shook his head. "It's watching you. It watches everyone. You have to leave before it gets dark." Before I could ask more, he turned and bolted into the woods. I considered going after him, but something in his voice, pure, raw fear, stopped me. I returned to the RV, uneasy. That evening, I found a mutilated deer near the edge of the pond. Its body was torn apart, the flesh twisted and shredded as if by massive claws. I've seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It looked deliberate. I decided to stay inside the RV that night. The generator kept cutting out, leaving me in darkness for minutes at a time. Each time the lights flickered back on, I thought I saw movement outside the windows, shadows darting just out of sight. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in place. My late wife's voice. "Stephen," Dana whispered, "come outside." I knew it wasn't real. I'd been dreaming of Dana ever since she passed, but this was different. Her voice was so clear, so close. When it called again, I almost opened the door before catching myself. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real." The whispers stopped, but the RV shuddered violently as if something heavy had slammed into it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tight, my heart racing. The shuddering stopped, leaving me in silence. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the RV's door, like claw marks. The boy, Ethan, appeared again, standing at a distance. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "It's hungry," he said. "It doesn't stop." "What is it?" I demanded, approaching him. "What's out there?" He hesitated, then muttered, "It's old. It was here before us. It feeds on fear, on grief. If you don't leave, it'll take you." I tried to get him to explain, but he ran off again. This time I followed him. He led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air colder. Finally, we reached a clearing with strange symbols carved into the trunks. Ethan pointed at them. "This keeps it out," he said. "Stay here if you want to live." Before I could ask more, he vanished into the trees. I looked around, my pulse hammering. The forest felt alive, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. I returned to the RV, but the hunger followed. That night, it showed itself. I was sitting by the fire when the forest went silent. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed yellow, fixed on me. "Dana," it said, its voice distorted and hollow. "Come to me." I stood frozen as it stepped closer. The firelight flickered, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The flesh was stretched and rotting, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and dashed it onto the fire pit, igniting a massive flame. The creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly shriek. I ran toward the symbols Ethan had shown me, the hunger chasing me through the trees. The moment I crossed the boundary of the symbols, the hunger stopped. It paced back and forth, hissing and snarling, but unable to cross. I stayed there until dawn, clutching the knife and listening to its guttural growls. When the sun rose, the hunger vanished. I returned to the RV, packed up, and drove away without looking back. I stopped at Maggie's store on the way out. She took one look at me and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people don't make it out." Later, I tried to find information about Ethan, but no one had seen a boy matching his description in years. Some said he was a ghost, a victim of the hunger long ago. Others claimed he was something else entirely, a guardian of sorts, protecting the living from the forest's darkness. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for certain. The hunger is real, and it's still out there, waiting. My name is Kenneth Warren. I'm 42 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I decided to take a break from the life I'd been barely holding together. My wife, Jenna, passed away last year, and the silence of my empty home had become unbearable. I'd always loved music. It's what I taught for years. But after she died, I couldn't bring myself to pick up a guitar. So I bought an RV and decided to travel, hoping to find something, anything, that would help me feel alive again. That's how I ended up at Big Shays State Park in Florida. I'd read about the park's rapids, the largest in the state, and thought their roaring, chaotic beauty might inspire me to compose again. What I didn't know was that the silence I'd been running from would find me there, in the voices of the dead. I pulled into the park just before dusk. The forest was dense and quiet, save for the distant roar of the rapids. The ranger station was empty, but I found a map pinned to the bulletin board outside. It marked a few trails and campsites, one of which was near the riverbank. That's where I decided to stay. As I set up my RV, a ranger approached, a woman in her 30s wearing the usual khaki uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. Her name tag read Laura. "Camping alone?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with concern. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just needed some peace and quiet." Laura nodded but hesitated. "The rapids can be unpredictable. Be careful if you hike near the water." She paused, glancing toward the tree line. "Some people say you can hear voices out there at night. Probably just the water playing tricks, but it can be unsettling if you're not used to it." I smiled, more amused than unnerved. "Thanks for the warning." Laura didn't return the smile. "Just don't wander too far." With that, she left, her words hanging in the cool evening air. After dinner, I sat outside the RV with my guitar, strumming idly as the last light faded from the sky. The sound of the rapids was louder now, a constant rush that drowned out the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and frogs. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of inspiration. Maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. Then I heard it, a faint giggle like a child's, carried on the wind. I froze, my fingers stilling on the strings. It was faint, almost drowned out by the river, but unmistakable. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer, just the river and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just an echo or my imagination playing tricks, and went inside to sleep. That night, I dreamed of Jenna. She was standing by the river, her back to me, humming the lullaby she used to sing when we were younger. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came from my lips. When I woke, my cheeks were wet with tears. The next morning, I decided to hike one of the trails that wound along the river. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks, but the unease from the night before lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something odd, small footprints in the mud, too small to belong to an adult. They ran alongside my own for a few steps before veering off toward the river. There were no other campers around, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. As I followed the trail, the roar of the rapids grew louder, almost deafening. Then I heard it again, a child's laughter, clear and sharp, cutting through the noise. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called. Again, no answer. Shaking my head, I pressed on, determined to reach the riverbank. When I got there, I found something even stranger, a small moss-covered doll lying on the rocks. Its face was faded and weathered, but its eyes seemed to glint in the sunlight, almost as if they were watching me. I picked it up, examining it closely. As I turned it over, a faint melody began to play, a music box tune, soft and haunting. My breath caught in my throat. The tune was the same lullaby Jenna used to hum. That evening, I couldn't shake the melody from my head. It felt like the forest was closing in, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. As I sat in the RV, the music box tune began to play again, faint at first, then louder. I searched the RV, convinced I'd accidentally brought the doll inside, but it wasn't there. The tune stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft knock at the door. I froze. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. No one was there, just the empty forest bathed in moonlight. Then I saw them, shadows flitting between the trees. They were small, childlike, moving too quickly to be human. My stomach churned as I realized they were circling the RV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The RV began to shake as if something, or many somethings, were pounding on the sides. I shouted for them to stop, but the noise only grew louder, the whispers and laughter blending into a chaotic cacophony. Finally, I grabbed my guitar and strummed the first chords that came to mind, playing louder and louder until the shaking stopped. The laughter faded, leaving only the sound of my music and the distant roar of the rapids. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but something drew me back to the river. I followed the trail again, clutching the doll I'd found. The voices were louder now, calling my name, singing the lullaby in eerie, childlike tones. When I reached the riverbank, the air grew icy and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to ripple like water. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The voices grew louder and the shadows took shape. 3 children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids. They stared at me, their expressions a mix of sadness and anger. "Help us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony. "What do you need?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They pointed to the doll, and in that moment I understood. They were tied to it, bound to the river by whatever tragedy had claimed them. I placed the doll on the ground and stepped back, watching as the children reached for it. But as their hands touched it, their forms began to twist and contort, their whispers turning to wails. The river surged, the rapids crashing violently, and the shadows rushed toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rocks, and ran as fast as I could, the screams echoing in my ears. I left Big Shays that day, vowing never to return. The doll stayed by the river, but the memory of those voices has haunted me ever since. I tried to write about it, to turn it into a piece of music, but every time I play, I hear their whispers in the background. A week after I got home, I found the doll on my porch. Its music box was broken, but sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it playing. My name is Jason Ellis, and I'm 37 years old. What I'm about to tell you isn't some tall tale for clicks or likes. It's the truth, even if I can't prove it. This happened in the summer of last year, deep in the heart of Hockomock Swamp, Massachusetts, a place some people call the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. I went in as a skeptic, thinking I'd spend a week documenting my survivalist skills for my blog. I came out broken, both physically and mentally, and I'm still not sure if I escaped at all. It started with an idea I'd had for months: test my skills by surviving 7 days alone in one of the most notoriously haunted places in the country. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. I thought the stories were just folklore blown out of proportion. So I packed my gear, tent, GPS, water purifier, knives and my GoPro, and drove to the edge of the swamp. The first thing you notice in Hockomock Swamp is the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the occasional drip of water and the squelch of mud underfoot. It was oppressive, but I chalked it up to the swamp's natural atmosphere. By late afternoon, I found a clearing to set up camp. As I hammered stakes into the soggy ground, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing but dense trees and mist. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking off the unease. That night, I built a small fire and recorded my first blog entry. I talked about the swamp's history, how the Wampanoag people believed it was a place of great spiritual power, and how locals whispered about strange lights and creatures. As I spoke, the words felt heavier than I expected, like they carried a weight I didn't understand. I fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. When I woke up, the fire was out, and something felt off. As I stepped outside the tent, I froze. Bare footprints surrounded my campsite. They were human-like but too large, with long claw-like toes. Maybe a prank, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Who would trek this far into the swamp just to mess with me? And why wouldn't I have heard them? I brushed it off, deciding to explore further into the swamp. My GPS flickered in and out, forcing me to rely on a map. Around midday, I stumbled upon something bizarre, a crude shrine made of animal bones and sticks perched on a stone slab. The air around it was colder, almost suffocating. I took a few photos and moved on quickly, feeling an inexplicable dread. That night, as I edited footage by the fire, I noticed my knife was missing. I searched the tent, my backpack, nothing. Finally, I found it stuck in a nearby tree, blade first, as though it had been thrown with precision. My stomach churned. I didn't sleep well. On the third day, my water purifier broke. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to boil water from now on, which would cost me precious time and energy. The swamp seemed to mock me, its stillness amplified by my rising frustration. That night, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay in my tent, the sounds became distinct, my name spoken softly over and over. Jason, Jason, help me. It sounded like my ex-girlfriend's voice, fragile and pleading. My rational mind told me it was a trick of isolation, a manifestation of guilt. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the whispers moved, retreating into the darkness. I didn't follow. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon the shrine again, or at least I thought it was the same one. This time, the bones were arranged differently, and symbols were carved into the trees around it. What the hell? I muttered, taking a step back. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, crouched low to the ground. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't remember running back to camp, but I must have. By the fifth day, I was a mess. My gear felt like a hindrance more than a help, and I was down to my last energy bar. The whispers had grown louder at night, and my maps didn't seem to align with the terrain anymore. I was lost. That evening, as I boiled water over a dwindling fire, I heard a branch snap. I turned and saw it, the figure from before, now closer. Its face, it was my face, but wrong, stretched and twisted. Leave me alone, I shouted, throwing a rock at it. The creature didn't flinch, instead it mimicked my voice. Leave me alone. I backed into the tent, clutching my knife like a lifeline. Desperation clawed at me. On the sixth day, I tried to retrace my steps to the edge of the swamp, but every path seemed to loop back to the shrine. I felt trapped, like the swamp itself was conspiring against me. That night, the entity grew bolder. It slashed at my tent, tearing through the fabric like paper. I scrambled out, swinging my knife wildly, but the creature danced just out of reach. It was toying with me. On the final day, I decided I had nothing to lose. I gathered dry branches and doused the shrine in lighter fluid. As the flames roared to life, the swamp seemed to shudder. The entity appeared again, screaming. Not a human scream, but a guttural, animalistic roar. It charged at me, its claws slicing across my arm as I stumbled backward. I swung my knife blindly, connecting with something solid. The creature shrieked and disappeared into the shadows. I ran. When I finally emerged from the swamp, I collapsed into the arms of a search and rescue team. I'd missed my check-in by 3 days, and they'd been combing the area. They didn't believe me about the creature. My footage was corrupted, and the photos I'd taken of the shrine were blurred beyond recognition. But sometimes late at night, I hear it, the whisper. My name. The swamp didn't let me go. It just gave me a head start. My name is Robert Gonzalez, and this story is from a year that feels like a lifetime ago. I was born and raised in the small town of Wellesley, Massachusetts. Not much happens here, which is why what I'm about to tell you is even more bizarre. It started innocuously enough. I was fresh out of college, back in my hometown, working a dead-end job at the local hardware store. Not exactly the life I'd envisioned, but hey, it paid the bills. My girlfriend, Lacey, had just moved in with me. We were both trying to save up for something better, but at least we had each other. One evening, my buddy Owen called. "Zachary, you up for a camping trip this weekend? Just the guys, like old times." Owen always had a knack for pulling me out of my funk. "Sure, why not?" I replied, figuring a weekend in the woods might clear my head. Friday rolled around and we packed up Owen's beat-up truck with all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, and a decent stash of beer. It was me, Owen, Kyle, and Benny. We headed out to a spot in the Berkshires, a place we'd camped a few times before. It was remote, quiet, and far from the hassles of daily life. We got there just before dusk, set up camp, and lit a fire. The night was filled with laughter and stories. It was like we were kids again, with no responsibilities, no worries. Around midnight, I decided to hit the sack. The others were still up, talking and joking. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, their voices faded into the background, mingling with the sounds of the forest. I woke up to silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. I sat up and noticed that Owen, Kyle, and Benny were all fast asleep. Stepping out of the tent to stretch my legs and take a leak, I saw the moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. As I stood there, I heard a rustling noise in the trees. Probably a deer or some other animal, I thought. But then I saw it, a shadowy figure moving among the trees. It was tall, hunched over, and moving with an unsettling grace. My first thought was that it was a bear, but something about its shape was all wrong. "Hey, who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. The figure stopped, turned toward me, and then vanished into the darkness. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I finished up and went back to the tent, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning I told the guys what I'd seen. Owen laughed it off. "Man, you probably had one too many beers. Nothing out here but us and the wildlife." The others agreed, and we went about our day, hiking and exploring the area. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting around the fire again, talking about old times, when we heard a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a woman, but there was something primal about it, something that chilled me to the bone. "What the hell was that?" Kyle asked, his face pale. Benny, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's Bigfoot. Or worse, Kyle's ex-girlfriend." We laughed nervously, but the tension was palpable. We decided to check it out, grabbing flashlights and heading in the direction of the scream. The woods were dense, and the beams of our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. After about 10 minutes, we came across a small clearing. In the middle of it was a deer, or what was left of one. It had been torn apart, its insides strewn across the grass. "Oh my God," Benny whispered. "What could have done this?" Kyle asked. "Mountain lion, maybe?" Owen suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We heard another rustle in the trees, and all our flashlights swung toward the sound. The figure was back. Standing at the edge of the clearing, it was taller than I'd realized, easily 7 feet, with long, matted hair and glowing eyes that reflected the light from our flashlights. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted back toward the campsite. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. We didn't stop until we were back at the fire, panting and wide-eyed. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Agreed," Owen said. "Let's pack up and leave, now." We scrambled to gather our things, tossing them haphazardly into the truck. The forest around us seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. Just as we were about to get in the truck, Benny screamed. We turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the campsite, its eyes locked onto us. Without thinking, I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and hurled it at the creature. It let out a roar and retreated into the woods. "Drive!" I yelled. Owen didn't need to be told twice. We sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing over the rough terrain. The moonlight flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the windshield. We drove for what felt like hours until we reached a small town. Finding a diner that was still open, we stumbled inside, disheveled and shaken. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, looked at us with concern. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring us coffee. "Something like that," I muttered. We told her a sanitized version of what had happened, just enough to explain why we were so rattled. She listened, nodding occasionally. "You know, there are old legends about these woods," she said. "Stories of creatures that aren't quite human. Most folks dismiss them as just that, stories. But you never know." We spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, we drove back to Wellesley in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never spoke about that night again. Not really. It was like an unspoken pact, a way to keep the fear at bay. Lacey noticed the change in me right away. "Zachary, what happened out there?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a weird trip. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. None of us were. Owen moved to another state a few months later, saying he needed a fresh start. Kyle and Benny drifted away, their laughter and jokes now tinged with an edge of unease. As for me, I stayed in Wellesley, but I never went camping again. I sold my gear, got a new job, and tried to put that night behind me. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that scream, and I wonder what it was we saw out there in the woods. Life went on, as it does, but the shadows of that night never entirely left me. Years later, Owen called me out of the blue. "Zachary, we need to talk." We met at a bar halfway between our towns. He looked older, more worn. We ordered beers and sat in silence for a while. "I can't stop thinking about it," Owen finally said. "That night, I've tried to move on, but it's always there, like a shadow." "Same here," I admitted. As the years passed, the memory faded but never disappeared, and maybe it never will. I grew old, watching my children grow up and start families of their own. I told them stories about my youth, but I never mentioned that night in the bunkers. Then one evening, my son Max, now a grown man with a family of his own, came to visit. We sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he turned to me with a serious expression. "Dad, do you remember that camping trip you went on years ago? The one you never talk about?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, I remember." Max nodded. "I've been doing some research. There are stories about those woods, stories that go back centuries. People talk about seeing things, hearing screams. I think you saw something real, something that shouldn't be there." I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of old fears. "Maybe, but there's no point in dwelling on it. We survived, and that's what matters." Max nodded, but I could see the curiosity and determination in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know that I believe you, Dad. Whatever it was, you're not alone." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. Maybe the past would never fully let go, but I had my family, and that was enough. Life is full of mysteries, some better left unexplored. I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will, but I've learned to live with the shadows, to find light in the moments that matter. And that's enough for me.